Hello everyone, welcome back to my YouTube channel, and in today's video we'll be exploring the ideas of one of the most influential thinkers in Western political philosophy, Jeremy Bentham. Jeremy Bentham is known as the father of utilitarianism. From his early life to his lasting impact, especially on modern legal and political systems, his philosophy becomes as a pertinent piece of knowledge for every CSS aspirant. So let's begin. And we will begin by talking about his, early life and talking about factors that actually shaped his political philosophy. So, he was an English person. He grew up in England. He was an Englishman. And back in the days, the people who were very rich and affluent in England, they used to pursue the profession of law. And even though his father had envisioned a legal career for him, Bentham soon became disillusioned with the English legal system. He believed that the British legal system is a very outdated and unjust system, and that is why we talk about two major influences that shaped his political philosophy. The first being the Age of Enlightenment, which emphasized reasoning, science, and individual rights, and the second factor was the age of legal reformers like Cesare Beccaria. Whenever we read about criminology, the name of Cesare Beccaria is very important, as he's known as the classical philosophers who shaped the idea of advocacy, criminal justice, and the perception towards crime. So Jeremy Bentham was such a person who had influence of such classical ideas that founded that were founded on the principles of egalitarianism, equality, and basically they opposed the idea of traditional law, governance, and ethics. And he was very stern in his approach to develop rationality and reformatory ideas in philosophy, which we'll be seeing. So yes, these were the major influences that impacted Jeremy Bentham's early life, and that is why we see that his political philosophy is somehow impacted by the idea of scientific rationalism, in which he believes that political systems should be evaluated like scientific hypotheses based on outcomes and not traditions. So when we read British political system, we see that the conventions are given a lot of importance over there. They prioritize the traditions more over a scientific approach of cost benefit analysis. So Bentham was someone who was like, instead of just focusing on ideas or how things should be done, as it was said by the classical philosophers, he believed that there needs to be a change in the way the legal system in any country works, because this, in a way, caters to the needs of the people and the needs of the citizens. At the same time, he believed that social reforms were needed. He did not believe in the idea that the law that is once made is alpha and omega. He believed that people and the law should work for the greatest good of the greatest number. In the beginning, I said that he's known as the father of utilitarianism. So if I am to summarize the meaning of utilitarianism, it actually means the greatest good for the greatest number of people, which focuses on utility over privilege. And at the same time, he was opposed to natural rights theory. So natural rights is something that we believe that a certain class of people should have these rights. For example, the right to life, right to liberty, right to property, etc., etc. He said natural rights are no such things. These are all illusions. And he said that rights should be created by law, not assumed by nature. Nature does not make you superior or inferior. In fact, it's the legal system that defines who needs to have what and how much. You get my point? That is what he believed in. And then he believed in legal positivism. Now, legal positivism actually talks about attributing scientific methods to legal procedures, which means that you are going to be talking about observations, you are going to be talking about statistical analysis, data analysis, and it kind of paved way to separate law from morality, focusing on what the law is, not what it ought to be, right? So this was a great change that was introduced by Jeremy Bentham, and this is also something that had influenced him in his initial years. Okay, so let's talk about the major characteristics of Jeremy Bentham's political philosophy. So, Jeremy Bentham believed in the idea of utilitarianism, and as I've discussed it before, utilitarianism means the greatest happiness principle. So, at the heart of Bentham's philosophy is utilitarianism, which he defines as the greatest happiness of the greatest number is the measure of right and wrong. So, he says if you want to evaluate what is right, what is wrong, you need to see how many people are happy with a decision that is made. It does not matter, that in nature it could be a negative thing, but if a lot of people are happy with it and they like this decision, so that is what we should proceed with, and that automatically becomes the right thing. So basically he laid a lot of responsibility or emphasis on the wellness of the people, on the happiness of the people, which means that law, actions and policies should be evaluated based on how much happiness and how little pain they produce for the majority. It shifts political focus from ideals or traditions to practical consequences. At the same time, he also believes that a good law or action is one that maximizes collective welfare, not just serves elites or rulers. So this is very important. And if I talk about CSS point of view, such questions are very important in essay, where you are supposed to talk about welfare state, public policy, or democratic governance. At the same time, he also talked about legal positivism. Bentham is one of the founders of legal positivism, which argues that law is what is written and enforced, not what is morally right. So it's not about morality every time. It's about looking at the circumstances to make law perfect for changing times. And he also said that a law can be unjust but still be law. For example, discriminatory law may be legal even if immoral. So it's like if it's favoring a large number of people, it should be done. And this also, kind of enforces the idea that the goal of law should be utility, not morality. This breaks from thinkers like Locke, who saw law as tied to natural rights. When we'll read about law, you'll get to know what I'm trying to say. But John Locke was someone who kind of attributed the idea of law to natural rights, and he created a link because rights and duties are somehow related, and these fall into the spectrum of law. But for Jeremy Bentham, these were two different things. He believed that morality has nothing to do with law whatsoever. And then, of course, he also focused on democratic principles. He supported universal suffrage. But this is something that he supported in later parts of his life. He also believed in electoral accountability and regular elections. He believed in transparency in government as essential to public trust. He believed that people are the best judges of their own happiness. So governments must represent the interest of the majority. So basically, you see that he kind of supported the idea of democracy, law, and accountability. And then, of course, he also promoted the idea of codification of law, a very important philosophical idea in criminology. He wanted all laws to be written and accessible. This is something that in the English legal system, it was not promoted very much. And people used to believe more in conventions and traditions. But, and we also, normally say that the English law is unwritten. English constitution is unwritten, but still the little bit of written part that we have is because of philosophers or thinkers like Jeremy Bentham, because he believed that when the law is not written, then people rely on obscure precedents. And obscure precedents are not a very good source of taking inspiration from in matters of legality. And he also believed that codified laws reduced ambiguity and made the justice system more equitable. And it also promotes transparency and consistency in legal decisions, which is very important. And of course, he talked about penal reforms and proportional punishment, very, very important, especially from the point of view of criminology. When I'm talking about Jeremy Bentham, it feels like I'm just delivering a lecture in criminology's, different theories. So, well, moving forward, Bentham believed that punishment should only be used if it reduces future harm. It opposed capital punishment, of course, except for in extreme cases. And he was also opposed. He also opposed the idea of torture, public executions, and harsh punishments. Instead, he promoted the idea of proportional punishment, rehabilitation, and panopticon principles. So, I'll just explain all these things. So proportional punishment is something which means that if I've, murdered someone, I should be given a punishment which is proportional to the crime I've committed. It shouldn't be like, acid is thrown on me in return by the authorities. That shouldn't be done. For example, if I've been involved in you can say in a robbery, then my punishment should be something that equates, that equalizes the crime that I've committed. it shouldn't be something that is greater than the burden of the crime I've committed. Because when the punishment is, when the level of punishment for every crime is same, people kind of, have less fear for the punishment, and they believe that since the level of punishment for every crime is same, so why don't we move a step forward and do, an XYZ severe kind of crime, because punishment is anyways that we're going to get, and it's not gonna be any level easier or tougher, because there's one standard. For example, if anyone who commits murder, rape, or theft, burglary, robbery, all such things is given capital punishment, then how can you bring a change? Because everyone's going to have the same level of punishment. And in this way, what happens is that if someone commits crime, there are different reasons, right? Social, political, economic, psychological, physiological reasons for which they commit crime. So when you keep a standard, such a strict standard of punishment, what happens is that you are reducing the room for reformation and reducing the space for betterment for the criminals. And now when we talk about what Bentham advocated for, he believed in rehabilitation. So rehabilitation, he believed that yes, you should focus on rehabilitation of the criminals, because he could have committed crime for XYZ reasons. This doesn't mean that you are not supposed to give punishment to someone. Yes, give the punishment, but make sure that the punishment should only be given if it actually is in the favor of people. For example, if someone has committed a rape and now you're going to punish them severely, then it should be with an intention, and also not only with an intention, but also with such strategies and logistical support that in future, reduces the threat of rape. I hope you're getting my point, right? In case if you're not clear about it, please let me know. I will try to explain you in a much easier way. And then his famous idea of the panopticon principle was that it basically talks about a prison model which focuses on surveillance and reform. Like when we talk about the jails, the prisons that exist today, they are horrible, like what can we say about countries like Pakistan and India when the jails in USA are in such a terrible position? Why? Because there the idea of crime is that, if they have committed a crime, no matter what, we are going to put them in a bad situation, bad circumstances, bad condition, like there's no reform for them. So when there's no reform for them, you're not going to, the idea of rehabilitation just diminishes. So basically his panopticon principle is, if anyone commits a crime or does something bad, you're supposed to keep them in such an environment where you can actually evaluate their behavior. You are able to conduct surveillance and then create reforms accordingly. You get my point? So that was something that he believed in. And then, of course, he also believed in the separation of church and state, because when he's so staunchly talking about democratic principles, accountability, regular elections, this automatically means that he diverged from the idea of the divine right theory, which means that the church and the state are closely associated. And he criticized the religious influence on law and politics. He advocated a secular legal system based on reason, not divine authority. And he also promoted the idea of equal treatment of all religions. At the same time, he also believed in economic liberalism with caution. Of course, he believed in democracy, which meant that in one way or another, he also promoted the idea of private property and free markets. But at the same time, he opposed monopolies and corrupt business practices, because he believed that for the larger audience or for the larger public, it was very detrimental. He believed in state intervention, and he said it was justified only when it improves public welfare. If again, the state intervention is with an intention or with, an idea to highlight elitism, then that is wrong, because only a few number of people are going to get a benefit from that. And he saw government as a tool to correct market failures. So, I think this is a really good approach that he had. And then he also, talked about individual versus collective good. His idea of, welfare of society differs from idea of Locke and Rousseau's idea of welfare of society. He said that, welfare of society is much important over individual liberties, but not in an authoritarian way. For example, he said rights are not inherent, like we say natural rights, since you were born white, so you have these rights. No, he said that law is supposed to give you certain rights. And this is because law is something that should promote collective happiness. He puts the burden of happiness or of the welfare of society on law and not on individuals. And he believed in strong but accountable governments. And at the same time, the role of state, when he talks about it, he says that the state is not sacred or traditional, but it is utilitarian tool, which means that he says that state is not something that you need to bow to. It is something that is there to assist you because you need to be happy as citizens. And he says that its legitimacy, basically the legitimacy of the state comes from serving the greatest happiness. If a law or policy fails to benefit the majority, it should be reformed or repealed. So this is what he believed in. And then one very important principle of his political philosophy is that he believed in hedonistic calculus, also known as specific calculus. So basically, he tried to quantify happiness. Bentham tried to quantify happiness, and for this he proposed that moral or political decisions should be made by calculating the pleasure versus pain. You know, how much pleasure or pain a law generates is what tells if it's right or wrong. This is called hedonistic calculus. Now, he defined hedonistic calculus into 7 factors. First one being intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, and extent. Right? These are the factors that he focused on. And for example, let me just give you an example. For example, if a policy increases healthcare access, it brings long-lasting widespread pleasure, so it scores high on the calculus. You get my point? So it was that kind of thing. It might seem, very easy, and you might be saying it, what a crazy idea it is. But actually, it just gives us a different perspective on how you can quantify emotions as well. And I think that's very smart. So the next point that we'll be discussing now is the criticism of Jeremy Bentham's philosophy. Okay, so when we talk about criticism of Jeremy Bentham's philosophy, there are quite a few points that I'm sure most of you would also have in your mind. While I was discussing his major points, you must have thought like, okay, but this is a big issue, why did he propose such a thing? But come on, let's just come to the point and talk about the major points of criticism in his philosophy. The first one is that he overemphasizes on quantifying pleasure. So this is known as the mechanical view of ethics, right? So we believe that emotions is something that cannot be quantified, right? But he put forth an idea that you can quantify emotions or pain and pleasure, and this is something that can be used to determine the utility of laws. However, this is one of a very strong criticism point of his philosophy, and people say, or scholars or academics say, that Bentham's hedonistic calculus tries to measure pain and pleasure mathematically. I just said plain, I'm sorry for that. And it is as if emotions and moral choices are purely numerical. Critics argue that not all pleasures are equal or measurable. Moral decisions often involve deep emotions, values, and complexities that cannot be reduced to number. Right? So, contrary to Bentham's point of view of quantifying emotions, John Stuart Mill, who we'll be discussing next, was someone who introduced qualitative view of pleasures. So, he believed that quality is important. He talks about quantity being an important factor. So, of course, it kind of makes it difficult for how you can quantify emotions. Now, are the legislators going to sit in the assembly and going to talk about if, this climate-related bill is going to bring utility for people? On how many levels are you going to check utility? How are you going to quantify the utility now? Or how are you going to quantify its extent? How will you do that? Are you going to consider the business sector? Are you going to consider the citizens who are living in a specific region? So it becomes very confusing, right? And then and the other point of criticism is the tyranny of the majority. So Bentham's principle of the greatest happiness of the greatest number can lead to ignoring minority rights. It could be quite possible that the greatest number of people are demanding for the greatest happiness, which is actually maybe discriminatory in nature. And if a majority gains pleasure from oppressing a minority, Bentham's system might still justify it. This criticism is central in democratic theory and human rights discourse, because at one place he's talking about democracy, egalitarianism, but at the same time he's kind of, justifying tyranny, right? And then he's also rejecting natural rights. He says that natural rights are nonsense on stilts. While this was a reaction to abstract thinking, it ignores the fact that basic rights like freedom and dignity are essential to modern human rights framework. His approach could justify oppressive laws if they are deemed useful. So, when we talk about natural rights, we also talk about the right to life, right to liberty, and all these wonderful rights that we have, that nature has given us, right? The right that no one is inferior or superior to other person. But he has such opposition to natural rights that he says, see, the only idea of rights or law is that what is written and what is codified. He was against the idea of the abstraction of the rights, that existed at that time in Britain, in the English legal system. He believed that since they are not codified, they have no value, they have no, no importance. So that is something that was rejected. And then he also ignores intentions and moral duty. So Bentham's theory is consequentialist. Only outcomes matter, not intentions or moral duties, right? This is what we said, the greatest number of people and the greatest happiness and all such things. So basically, your law is something that is going to be defined as good or bad on the basis of the outcome it has, which means that that's very risky. For example, if someone unintentionally causes happiness, it's considered good, even if their motive is selfish. This view is criticized for lacking a moral compass, right? He kind of detaches the idea of law with morality so much that law becomes something that is very stale. Law becomes void of emotion, or law becomes something that can be used as a tool very easily. Because you need to have that empathy, you need to have those emotions in legal matters as well, right? Only then you can take decisions for the underprivileged people of society, right? If they, for example, if there's a region where people in majority are rich, then they're going to make laws that favor them, and you're going to ignore the people who are poor. And the people who are rich might just have an intention of doing good for themselves and all that thing, while just reducing the importance of the poor people to nothing, which means that the intention is not taken into consideration. It's not always majority is right? It's not always, there's this saying that even if everyone is standing against a wrong decision and you are standing with the right decision, be courageous and stand with the right one. So in this case, in Bentham's case, if you're the only one standing for the right thing, then you are just going to suffer because the law is not going to favor you in any way. And then he does not have any clear role for justice and rights. Bentham's utility-based system may ignore principles like justice, fairness, and equality if they conflict with overall happiness. For instance, punishing an innocent person to calm a riot might be useful, but it's clearly unjust, right? His framework struggles to address such dilemmas. For example, if majority wants a certain person to get capital punishment, even though he did not do something wrong, even though if he was just someone who stood against the status quo, the people in power wouldn't like it. They would want him to just die. So you would want him to get capital punishment. Now, okay, according to Bentham's principle, that's a really good decision because majority people's majority happiness and all that thing. But what about individual rights? What about that action being just? Right? It's not a just action because just because one person used his freedom of speech to stand against the status quo cannot be given a capital punishment. You get my point? So this is where the ideas of justice, rights, equality get intersected or get confused with the idea of law. I hope you get my point. And then his legal system or his entire philosophy is too simplistic for complex societies. Now, modern critics argue that utility alone cannot guide all political and legal decisions. For example, in multicultural, pluralistic societies, different groups have different values. Happiness is subjective, right? Bentham's model doesn't address cultural diversity, historic context, or structural injustice, because if we would apply Bentham's political philosophy to modern societies, it means every other day there are going to be, capital punishments. Every day we are going to have rights. Every day we are going to have, such a legal system that is completely hijacked by civilian challenges. And it's not able to focus on what the law should do, to address maybe the criminal justice system, to be more, to be more revolutionary with time, to evolve with time. It would just get stuck into the cultural issues and happiness of people, and in one way or another it would lead to anarchy, something that in itself opposes Jeremy Bentham's idea of democracy and egalitarianism, right? I hope you get my point. So to conclude, we can say while Jeremy Bentham laid the foundation of modern utilitarianism, Okay, so as I was saying that, while Jeremy Bentham laid the foundation of modern utilitarianism and legal reforms, his ideas have faced serious challenges over time. These criticisms help us understand where utilitarianism works and where it falls short, especially in ethical, legal, and human rights context, right? And we can definitely put his political philosophy in perspective with respect to the contemporary challenges, political conflicts, and we can understand it. And this was the video for today. I hope you liked it. So today's video was quite different. Jeremy Bentham's political philosophy is quite different from that of Machiavelli and the classical philosophers. So I hope this was a good shift. And questions related to Jeremy Bentham are not quite often asked in the CSS exams. If question related to him is asked, it is mostly asked in comparison or in relation to J.S. Mill as well, because they both believed in utilitarianism, but they both had a different approach towards it. For example, Bentham had an approach of quantifying emotions, and J.S. Mill had an approach of using quality as his compass in defining the utility of law and the happiness of people. So this was it for today, and in our next video we'll be talking about J.S. Mill and his political philosophy. Thank you.